My old friend David Allen Green has written a tremendous article analysing the Supreme Court's decision yesterday. He's left a very interesting um, gap, a very interesting tale at the end, and I would like to get to that. But I think, first of all, let's just go through what he's said. He's said that the Rwanda removals policy is unlawful. And he said that the Supreme Court was rather clever in not depending on the European Court of Human Rights or the European Convention of Human Rights or the Human Rights Act, but instead the decision is based on international law and principles that are not opposed by the government. That's point one. Point two is that the decision is unanimous, so the government can't start nitpicking between different members of the Supreme Court. They all agree. And Lord Reid presented the case in a very detached and very noble way. So again, it would be very difficult for the government to smear him with the lefty lawyers' smear. So it's been a very carefully thought out issue. It also talked about our legal obligations that effectively prevent the UK from moving refugees to a third country. That's about the whole principle of outsourcing. Now, that would also involve some criticism, even if we were to outsource to Italy or to Albania or to Greece or Saudi Arabia, anywhere that's desperate for money and for our money, and indeed we've already wasted 140 million pounds. Maybe we can waste a little bit more by giving money to some other country which is in need. We could, of course, also outsource, and this is something that the Supreme Court doesn't criticise. We could outsource to our own territories. We could outsource, for example, to the Falkland Islands. I'm sure that would be a deterrent. And they pointed out that there was a real risk that when we outsource our responsibility to a third country, there is a possibility of refugees or migrants being returned to their country of origin without their application being properly addressed, the principle of non-refoulement. And this is something that the ECHR was pulled into the judgment, but only in passing, says David. So that was the legal test to be met, and the Supreme Court then emphasised the substantial and detailed evidence that had been brought before the court to be considered. And the court was persuaded by the evidence of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees particularly, and that formed the bulk of the response. That there was no firm basis for being confident. That's what David says. There's no firm basis for being confident that the Rwanda government would comply with its international obligations, and its evidence for that was that it had given a similarly firm undertaking to comply and had failed to do so with its agreement with Israel. And more than that, since this case has started, there have been incidents that have gone on in Rwanda which have drawn concern. So it's the UN rather than the ECHR which has been the basis of the testimony. So that undermines, David says, all the efforts to attack the Strasbourg court in the run-up to the verdict. And so whether the UK leaves the ECHR or not would make very little difference to the Supreme Court's decision. Now, the Supreme Court said that it was a legal decision, not a political decision, and it was therefore very careful to allow for the possibility that a political amendment could make the Rwanda scheme workable. Not a structural change, but a political modification, and that is effectively the hole into which Rishi Sunak has applied himself. But I don't think it's going to get away from the evidence of non-compliance by Rwanda with its international obligations, and what David points out are the non-binding assurances of the Rwandan government that have been contained in its memorandum of understanding with the UK. So what Rishi is now doing is to turn that memorandum of understanding with the UK into a treaty, which is a little bit more secure. But a treaty can also be broken by a casual government. So David says that the decision was a surprise because the Lord Reid was considered to be more deferential on policy matters, and although the court under Reid, and here I'm quoting, has been assertive about judicial power in respect of compliance by ministers with court orders, it has seemed to leave broader questions of policy to the executive and the legislature. So for Lord Reid to get involved in that specifically is astonishing. And I think that's I think David's observation that the Supreme Court was not dependent on the ECHR makes it much harder for Rishi Sunak to take that next step. That means that the next step was so much more of a shock. So Suella Braverman almost certainly had penned out a series of steps to be taken, and that would have been underpinned by legal advice. My concern is that legal advice would have been rather pitiful and rather biased. Lawyers, you can find a lawyer to say anything, frankly, and legal advice doesn't mean that it's tested in the courts. It simply means this is legal advice. At the end of his piece, David writes, "But the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman may be right in one respect in her letter to the Prime Minister published yesterday. The government now needs to show it has a plan B, as its preferred policy cannot be easily resurrected before the next general election." Absolutely. So the fact that we heard from Rishi Sunak yesterday evening is because he was goaded by Suella Braverman into demonstrating that he had an alternative option. Now, all the rumours that are coming out of Westminster is that alternative option is words alone. But it's very, very suspicious and disturbing words, and I feel personally that Rishi Sunak has crossed a red line, a major red line. He has demonstrated that he has the moral centre of a cabbage. I think that's one stage more alarming than Liz Truss's moral centre. And so what we have seen from Theresa May onwards, maybe presaged by Brexit, is the sad decay of the moral heart of British government. And without the moral heart, there is a question about whether or not the government is entitled to continue. It's certainly going to lose its voice of authority on the world stage.